To those of you online, welcome to those of you in the room. My name is Jeremy. I'm lead pastor here at Cornerstone. We are in the middle of a series in the Gospel of Mark, trying to discover who Jesus is, trying to walk alongside Mark in our lives and go, who is Jesus? Now, some of you have gone, I've come to church for a long time. I know who Jesus is. Fine. Some of you, like, I've never really explored who Jesus is. And you start to watch the dynamics, and we see these kinds of things, right? Like I don't know. I'm gonna talk a little bit political here for just a second, but I don't know where you fall politically. If you're left leaning, right leaning, I don't really care, to be quite frank with you. I care about you. I really don't care about your politics, and I mean that with the most genuine of concern. And I mean this in a way that we can talk about these kinds of things. We should be able to. And at the end of the day, if we're doing it well, you should know I'm not talking about you. And you should know you're not talking about me. That's going to be interesting all morning. But we start to grab on to all of these things that we think identify us. And when we think they identify us, we start to own the emotion of the world around us, so much so that we actually can't talk about it anymore. And in the life of Mark, with what he's doing with Jesus, we're going to watch this emotional episode today where Jesus is constantly unfolding who he is and revealing himself to the world. Mark is going to take note of this. And people are going to miss the deepest identity of Christ around them. And if we really get honest about it, in our world, we do the same thing. We become so attached to our ideals that we almost stop thinking. And in Jesus' world, people were so attached to their ideals that when the revelation of God came in the flesh in front of them, they missed it. I have never gone through an election cycle, whether the person I voted for won or lost, and without hoping something better for the world when that president is through. Does that make sense? Like every person who sat in the Oval Office and carried the title American president, I have hoped they would leave this country better than they found it when they took office. I've hoped that for every president of my lifetime as an adult. I didn't think about it as a kid. Like one time when I didn't understand voting when I was a kid, Casey, I tried to tell my grandfather we should vote for Big Bird one time. And he got mad at me. It was the Reagan-Mondale election. The Reagan-Mondale election, and he was complaining, and I went to the voting booth with him. And we came out, and he was trying to explain, and he told me that there was a place you could write down anybody's name in to vote for them for president. And I said, well, why don't you vote for Big Bird? I was probably your age. I got fussed at. It's not how you treat the office of the president. It's important. Well, when it comes to Jesus and his identity, you can't write in just anything. You can elect who you think Jesus is. But he tells you who he is. And then you have a different choice to make, and you can cast your vote one side or the other to accept Jesus on his terms or to go your own way. And we find that in the text today. It's an extended text, and I've wrestled back and forth with this because of my voice, but I happen to believe the word of the Lord is more important than my own. So I want to pick up reading in chapter 4. I'm going to begin in verse 35, and I'm going to give you a particular mark here, right? Here's an invitation. If you want to talk more about the opening part of chapter 4, we're not going to cover that here. We will talk about it a little bit on Wednesday night. There's a reason why I'm skipping this particular passage right here, the opening of 4. I'm skipping it. It's filled with lots of Jesus' teachings. Mark's emphasis in his writing is not on the teachings of Jesus. That would be Matthew. Matthew is filled with the teachings of Christ. Love to walk through Matthew with you sometime. Mark is going to bring some parables out. He's going to line up with the sermons that we see Jesus preach in Matthew and Luke. But really where Mark's going is he's going to kind of summarize some of those teachings, and he's going to drop you right into an episode that picks up in verse 35. And if we didn't have our modern chapters and verses, which were added later, like that's not how Mark wrote his gospel. He just wrote the story of Jesus. We broke it down later with sections to read. We would actually probably shift the chapter to verse 435 and go all the way through 6:6. That is going to take on a full episode. So it's a lot of scripture I want to read today, but we need to hear it, okay? So here's the word of the Lord for us today. On that day, when evening had come, he told them, let's cross over to the other side of the sea. So they left the crowd and took him along, since he was in the boat, and other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking over the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. He was in the stern, sleeping on the cushion. So they woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, Silence, be still. The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified. They began asking each other, Who then is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. They came to the other side of the sea, to the region of the Gerasenes. As soon as he got out of the boat, a man with an unclean spirit came out of the tombs and met him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one was able to restrain him anymore, not even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and he tore them apart, smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with the stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell down before him. He cried out with a loud voice, What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you before God, don't torment me. For he had told him, Come out of the man, you unclean spirit. What is your name? Jesus asked. My name is Legion, because we are many. And again begged Jesus earnestly to not send him out of the region. A large herd of pigs were there, feeding on the hillside. The demons begged him, Send us to the pigs, that we may enter them. And he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs. The herd of about 2,000 rushed down the bank into the sea and drowned. The men who tended the pigs ran off and reported it to the town and the countryside, and people went to see what happened. They came to see Jesus and saw the man who had been demon-possessed sitting there dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it described to them what happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs. And they began to beg him to leave their region. And him there is Jesus. Jesus, get out of here. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged him, Let me go with you. And Jesus did not let him. He told him, Go home to your own people. Report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he's had mercy on you. So he went out and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And they were all amazed. When Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the sea. One of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came. And when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, My little daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so that she can be well and live. So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd was pressing against him. Now a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. Having heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his clothes. For she said, If I just touch his clothes, I'll be made well. Instantly, the flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus realized in himself power had gone from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and you want to say, 'Who touched me?'" But he was looking around to see who had done this. The woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell before him and told the truth. "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction." While he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, "Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore." When Jesus heard what was said, he told the synagogue leader, "Don't be afraid, only believe." He did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, James's brother. They came to the leader's house and they saw the commotion. People were weeping and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why are you making such a commotion? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they laughed at him, and he put them all outside. He took the child's father and mother and those who were with him. He entered the place where she was. He took the little girl by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which is translated, "Little girl, wake up." Immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old. At this, they were utterly astounded, and he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this and told them to feed her. He left and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished. Where did this man get these things? What is this wisdom given to him? And how are these miracles performed by his hands? Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't these his sisters? And they were offended by him. Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown, among his relatives and his household." He was not able to do a miracle there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And Jesus was amazed at their unbelief. He was going around the villages teaching the word of the Lord. It's a long episode, but you got to see some of the connections that are happening, right? Like Jesus calms the storm and his disciples are like totally wigged out by it. Who is this? They were terrified. Who is this that can calm the sea? He cast out the demon at the Gerasenes location. Thousands of demons, the pigs charge off. Chains couldn't bind him. Stones couldn't break him. Jesus freed him. And the people were mad. He heals a sick woman that doctors had manipulated for years. She's in such a position, like when you understand the position of this woman, she should have never been in the crowd. She had a bleeding issue. Women who had bleeding issues, whether it was a natural cycle or it was something significantly medically wrong, like with this woman, were considered outcasts until they were clean. Their place was with the lepers, not the community. They had their own spot to go to. She sneaks in. She touches Jesus' cloak. He heals her. At best, her husband or her dad should have talked to Jesus on her behalf. In the culture of the ancient world, she had no one to represent her. And in her fear and desperation and faith, she touches Jesus. And he says, daughter. Like the whole world had rejected her. And he says, daughter, your faith has healed you. Like there's reasons why I get emotional with this text. It's crazy. And then Jairus, a Pharisee who's been plotting to kill him, Take note of that. He's the leader of the temple, and these guys are plotting to kill Jesus. That's what we've seen in chapter 2 and chapter 3. They're so mad at Jesus. They can't stand him. They want him dead. The man who's been plotting to kill him, his daughter, is now desperate, and he goes to Jesus. Jesus knew their hearts. It says that in other texts before this. He could have said, Jairus, you want nothing to do with me, man. You're on your own, kid. And he doesn't. He goes to the house and he wakes the little girl up. But people mocked him. And then he gets to his own hometown and they say, isn't this the carpenter? In Matthew's gospel, they'll say the carpenter's son. Now, why is it different? I'm not for sure. I would make the argument that Jesus was a professional rabbi, and there's reasons for that. We can talk about that later if you want to. But it's a slander. Everybody knew Jesus' story. His mama got pregnant before she got married. This is the carpenter's son. Carpenter's son. Joseph isn't even his daddy. You notice what they say in the text? Isn't Mary his mother? And these his brothers and sisters? They never mention Joseph. Do you know why? Because they believe Jesus to be illegitimate. So to call him the carpenter, even if you have that bumper sticker, is actually an insult. In the ancient world, they are mocking him. That's your baby mama, but who's your daddy? You don't even know, do you, Jesus? Carpenter. So how is he able, this illegitimate bastard son, how is he able to perform miracles and teach the way he does? And they're mad. And we see this unfold in this text. Like you got to see the whole episode together. A lot of times we break it down because it feels too much. But when you see the whole episode together, Jesus is confronting us with his identity. And we have to choose on our own to see him as he is or to reject him completely. And the question becomes, who is Jesus? We'll get more into that in chapter 8. He awoke, he calmed the sea, they obey, and his disciples are afraid. Jesus showing his power over nature is showing he's not just a teacher or a prophet, he's God. Consider what the psalmist says, right? You rule the raging sea. When its waves surge, you still them. Psalm 89 is a beautiful psalm about the power of God the Creator. And his disciples eyewitnessed this. And instead of being thankful that they got delivered, they were terrified at his power. How the sea obeys him? Like, remember how cool they thought it was when Jesus said, follow me? They dropped their nets immediately. They weren't afraid then. But now, the sea obeys him? Maybe they should be terrified. Because Jesus is telling them, he's told it before, I have authority to forgive sin. I'm God. The seas be still. I'm God. And they walk away trembling. This demon, what do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? When we see this passage, and we've talked about this last week with all the crowd following Jesus, Jesus is in a non-Jewish city right now. When we see the Decapolis, it means the 10 cities. So these 10 little cities have come together for one big region. Jesus is there. It is a Gentile, non-Jewish province. So here's Jesus with the Gentiles, non-Jewish people, freeing this man from the demons. And this man begs to go with Jesus. And he says, no, stay here. And what does he do? He starts to tell people about the power of Jesus in a region that wouldn't hear of him for a while. Like the power and influence of who Jesus is and what's happening here. And we see this, and it's just shows like his authority over the supernatural proves that no darkness is too great for his light. And him touching the Gentile tells everybody watching that the kingdom of God isn't just about us, which would have been the Jewish world at the time. That God's plan from the very beginning was for every single person who would ever breathe. Jesus comes with such power and authority, and he's demonstrating it. In this section of Mark, you see it. You see this question of who is this? Who is this? Who is this? And it's not just who does he think he is. You ever had that conversation with someone before? Who do you think you are? Well, last I checked. Like, wouldn't it be cool, like, if we just could, like, we could walk in like the Lord of the Rings? I am Jeremy, son of... Well, I don't actually know who my dad is, so that'd be like an awkward conversation, but we could, cousin of Boromir or whatever, And you get into these, but no, we don't even do that. Like, we start off like this. Hey, I'm Jeremy, and I'm a pastor. Or you may say, well, I'm Joe, and I'm a plumber. I don't know why Joe's always the plumber, probably from the election a few years ago. But you get those kinds of things, and we start with what we do. Tells people who we are. I'm husband of Corey, father of, and by the time I finish, people would be asleep. Right? But Jesus shows up and he does stuff, and Jesus does stuff that only God can do. And rather than going, that's God, he's got a plan for us, they go, who is this? Who does he think he is? Doing this or that. Touching Gentiles. Dealing with pigs. Like the Jews should have celebrated that. They don't like pigs anyway, right? But the Gentiles, on the other hand, they loved a good pork loin. This is a way of life for them. An entire way of life was cast into the sea. And yet this man who had caused such trouble and fear becomes a direct witness into a world where Jesus is needed. The demons recognize him. In our world, evil feels overwhelming. It's a reminder. This is a reminder that he's already won the victory. Just think for a minute. I don't care what your politics are, but you'll hear people in the news and the media, they'll say things, and your politicians will say things. We just want to be on the right side of history. Here's a secret. In Jesus, you already are. I'm on this side of the resurrection. The real question gets down to, are you on the right side of Jesus? And that's what we don't ask enough. Because we really want Jesus to baptize our politics and go, yeah, we're good because he's good with us. That's not the question, is Jesus good with you? The question is, are you good with him? Because he's the one who has power over wind and waves and demons. The natural world and the supernatural world bow to him. And no matter what the darkness is and how bleak it seems, he's already won the victory. That's Jesus. Not am I on the right side of history, am I on the right side of him? That's the real question. Turning on light in a dark room, the darkness doesn't just fight back, it vanishes. You ever walked in a room and like the light just kind of flickers on? And then eventually it's boom, it's full blown. Once the light's on, there's no more darkness. Where light shines, darkness can't exist. Done. And with Jesus, he turns the lights on to all of creation that slept in darkness, lived in darkness, worked in darkness. The complete brokenness of sin over all of creation. And Jesus turns the light on because sin no longer has victory in any of its forms, natural or supernatural. Jesus wins. So we see this start to come out. In Jesus' time, the supernatural, that was feared. Today, it's often dismissed. We don't know how to deal with the supernatural world. We don't know how to think about the unseen world. It becomes really weird and crazy when people talk about these things. I won't go into any stories today. Yet we still battle unseen forces, addictions, spiritual oppression, inner darkness. Some of those things are spiritual wounds. We talk about psychological wounds, physical wounds. Some of those things are spiritual wounds. Some of us have faced spiritual bullies and we can't give a name to it. Yet if you're in that space, Jesus has victory over the natural things, the addictions, the oppressions, and the supernatural things, the unseen things that we don't even know how to name. He has authority and power. He has both. You know, for all the executive orders that were signed in the last couple of weeks, how many of them get challenged in Supreme Courts and these kinds of things? There's a difference between having authority or power and having authority and power. Jesus has both. He has authority and power to fulfill completely the good work of God in your life and mine, over the natural world and the supernatural world. To the ruler of the synagogue, what a message. Do not fear, only believe. To the woman, don't be afraid, your faith has saved you. Jesus is demonstrating a unique authority over sickness and death. When you get to the end of this conversation, a woman who has been treated by doctors for 12 years, completely isolated from the world around her, Jairus' daughter declared death by the testimony of the people around them. It was a hopeless situation. Don't bother the teacher anymore. I don't know what your hopeless situation is, but I dare you to bring it to Jesus. Because in his hands, nothing is hopeless. We can think that it is. But his victory isn't empty. The grave is. The tomb is. Heaven's throne is not. The cross is barren. The throne is not. Jesus invites us to bring our hopelessness to him. He restores both. He proves his power over sickness and death. And when you start to see this happen, rather than celebrate that God has come, the people around him become more angry, more antagonistic. I remember when I was in high school, I ran with a wrong crowd. I sold drugs, did drugs, broke into houses, stole cars. I did everything you can imagine bad behind the scenes. And out front, I was an A student and I was winning theater awards and athletic awards and speaking awards. I was so jacked up as a person, trying to live this duplicity of lives. When I gave my life to Jesus just before high school graduation, I go to college and I'm learning how to live into this new life of Christ. And I come home for the first time. People ask, what's wrong with you? What happened to you? Why aren't you the same? I'm like, I'm better. I've been rebuilt. I'm not just the $6 million man. I'm the eternal man. It's not bionic. It's made new. My friends couldn't understand it. And Jesus' people, like he's in his hometown, they don't get it. Right? They don't get who he is. They look at all this stuff and they see what's going on and they go, who is this that can do these things? Like a physician treats symptoms. I had issues. I should have been going to counseling for a long time. Instead, I found Jesus. The counselor would have treated the symptoms, but Jesus gave me life. There's room for both, by the way. What I just said is not to neglect going to counseling and finding help. Get help. But your issues don't give you life. They steal it from you. Jesus gives life. It's both. making sense of the world when my world doesn't make sense. I need Jesus to come and reorganize my life. Not just treating the symptoms, giving life. The question for us is, do we trust Jesus with what feels most hopeless, where we feel most helpless? Can I enter into that space and go, you, Jesus, are God, and I need you to move here? Or do I go, Jesus, I go to church sometimes, but I don't know about you. Like we get into these spaces where we really don't surrender to Jesus. We dabble with tradition and religion, but we don't really surrender to Christ. And that invitation of surrender is an invitation to life. And that's where he calls us to. With the things that are the darkest and most helpless, come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy laden, and find rest for your souls. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. What a beautiful phrase from the giver of life. And we will look at all of these things, and we have to go, who is Jesus? Those who were closest to him took offense to him. What a statement. Those who were closest to him took offense to him, and he was amazed by their unbelief. I wonder if Jesus is still amazed at the unbelief of the world today. I wonder if from the throne of heaven he looks at all of the world and goes, how can they still not believe what I've done? The world has only gotten worse for all the fancy technology they have, for all the smarts they have, for all the blessing I've put into their lives, and they still don't believe. I wonder if he just sits back and goes, wow. Or like, you ever see like the memes of like facepalm Jesus? I wonder, does he sit on the throne and do that? Or does he sit on the throne in amazement and weep? I've done so much for you. I'm still here for you. Here's the invitation. Won't you come? We're not given that answer. But it makes me wonder that he looked at their unbelief and was amazed. It says that he could do no miracles there. He wasn't powerless. Remember, the very power of God rested in him. He wasn't powerless. The people wouldn't believe it if they saw it. They could not attribute to Jesus who he was because all they saw was their perception. They would ask, isn't this the carpenter? The insult. You don't even know your dad. We'll mention your mom, but man, you illegitimate child. They couldn't reconcile his power with their perspective. They were shook. It made no sense. And 2,000 years later, we have the same issue. We have a perspective of who we think God is and who we think Jesus is. Sometimes that perspective is religious and sometimes it's not. And we have a hard time reconciling Jesus' power because of our perspective. When I travel across the world, I see stuff I've never seen in the United States before. I see people get up and walk who were brought to us on mats and we lay hands. I've watched a man pray over a dried up cow and that cow start to give milk. It was insane. I've seen a man pray over a radio that was corroded with no batteries and it came on. And I come to the United States and we want to argue over theology and how we do church and what songs we should sing and how we should baptize somebody and what translation we should read. Should I stand up or sit down or kneel down or speak Latin? And we miss the power of Jesus because we're so caught up in our own perspectives. And then what happens for a lot of people, the rejection limited what he did there. He was amazed at their unbelief. What happens with a lot of people? We're still in this place today, right? Familiarity breeds contempt. Because they knew who he was, they couldn't believe what he did. They thought they knew him. And we see these same kinds of things in our world. We see the same tensions. I've seen this before. I'm not impressed. I'm not amazed. This is the same old story. And we struggle with these things. And here we are 2,000 years this side of the cross and the resurrection. In modern America, where Jesus is well known by name, but dismissed in practice. Same pattern. We might as well be Jesus' hometown. I've heard this Jesus story for 2,000 years. What makes you think it's going to change my life now? And until we see Jesus for who he is, we will not experience that power in our lives. We will be much like his hometown, refusing to see him because our perspective says something very different. And I can tell you all day long that I believe 100% that Jesus stopped the storm and the supernatural world obeyed him. And he can heal sickness and conquer death. I could tell you about the power of Jesus in my life and where I've seen him move and how he's changed me. And at the end of the day, you still have to respond, who is Jesus? Will I accept him on his terms? Or will I miss him because of my perspective? And because he's good and gentle with power, he leaves the decision to you. Who do you say that he is? Can you approach him on his terms and experience his power? Or will you reject him because 2,000 years have proven to you that he's no different than any other story ever told? The choice is yours. That's the tension of the king and the cross.